Okay, so a quick one we wanted to talk about is Apple just had their new iPad event last week. They released a couple of new iPads. That wasn't very interesting, but then they released an ad and the internet went wild. And this ad basically showed this beautiful set of musical instruments, painting instruments, record players, all of this gorgeous stuff. And then they were put between a vice and just crushed violently and slowly. And then the reveal was, after they were all crushed down to nothing, the iPad was revealed. The iPad Pro, I believe it was. And so the implication, of course, is that all of these amazing things, all of these amazing capabilities fit into this one tiny device. But the internet took it differently. There was a massively negative reaction. What do we think caused that?
Look, the narrative of the reaction is, artists are at risk of losing their jobs and AI is coming after artistic expression and Apple is historically on the side of artists and they're showing all of this stuff being carelessly crushed down by technology and it was kind of thoughtless and careless and tone deaf and all this kind of stuff. I think this says two things. On the legitimate side, I think there's a real anxiety, as we talked about these emotions. Right? There's a real anxiety around AI and around technology coming for everybody's jobs. And everyone thought artists would be immune or protected from this, and they'd be the last to be disrupted by technology. And I think that's a legitimate concern, and artists are a little bit anxious about that. On the other hand, though, I think there's a frivolous or ridiculous part of this, which is that, the more extreme right-wing commentators call this the woke mind virus, victim mentality. I think there's more sensitive ways of describing this, but I do think that there is this culture now or this kind of profiteering and outrage and exaggeration. And I do think people are excessively sensitive. They can't take a joke. They can't take things for how they're intended. They can't read between the lines. They can't handle a little bit of controversy or offense. Or worse than all of that, they can take it, but they pretend like they can't. And they're just like creating false controversy and nonsense. And I think it's all.
And now we're contributing to it.
I think it's really, frankly, a little bit of noise.
I think this was just massive groupthink. I think that, this is an example of, yes, absolutely, people having an outsized reaction to something. Having said that, it's because it struck a nerve. It poked a sore spot or a wound. People are having some kind of emotional knee-jerk reaction fueled by loss aversion and nostalgia. And so nobody is taking your trumpets or your metronomes, but the people, ironically, the people who lament those items have probably never owned or used one. And it all feels a little bit performative to me in terms of this general massive groupthink and outrage. My hot take on this is that it was a hugely successful ad. Absolutely no one would be talking about the iPad launch, that they just made this product thinner. And here is everyone talking about the iPad launch. And if that's what advertising is meant to do, this was a massively successful ad. Great creative is controversial. People hated a lot of the early Apple, dancing or the I'm a Mac, I'm a PC ads. Those ones were maybe not as controversial in their time. But when a piece of advertising or a piece of creative is controversial and it provokes a response, it is hugely successful. I think that maybe the only miss was that they probably, if you play the ad backwards or it's expanding, it tells the same story. And I didn't come up with that. I read that on X, on Twitter. Someone, I can't remember who it was, put that idea out there, and it's accurate. It tells the same story, what they were trying to convey, but in a less controversial way. And would that have received the same press, or would we be talking about it in this episode? Absolutely not. So Ben Thompson, the author of Stratechery, wrote, one thing he credits Apple for is not trying to erase the ad from the internet. It's still posted on CEO Tim Cook's X account because it's important, not just as a marker of what's happened over the last few years, but also the choices facing us in the years ahead. And that's a more serious take on it. And sure, I buy that. I also just think it was massively performative.
The other take I saw on this that, in a sense similar, is like Steve Jobs would never have allowed this. Right? Like it goes against Steve Jobs' aesthetic. And it's like, well, you mentioned nostalgia. There's this element of Steve Jobs nostalgia that is kind of annoying as well, which is like, he was a great man and he is sadly no longer with us. It is not Steve Jobs' Apple anymore, and that is how it should be, right? What would be worse is an Apple that was stuck in time trying to second guess itself, thinking, what would Steve do? Because that is not how you build a successful company, right? So yes, maybe Steve Jobs wouldn't have liked this ad. Maybe he never would have approved it. Who cares?
I think he would have. I think he would have loved it. People saying Steve Jobs would have never done this is such a cop-out. They're right. Steve Jobs would have never just kept releasing the same thing, but thinner. That's the difference. Steve Jobs would have said, okay, we've done it with this iPad thing. Let's think about what's the next, talk about form factors. What's the next form factor? What's the next paradigm shift?